12 lesser-known philosophers who shaped the world. When we hear the word philosopher, most people immediately think of names like Socrates, Plato, Descartes, or Nietzsche. It's as if the history of philosophy only belongs to a few towering figures, endlessly quoted and recycled through classrooms, books, and memes. But what if I told you that behind those famous names, quietly in the shadows, there were other thinkers? Minds that didn't make it into the spotlight, but without whom many of the ideas we take for granted today wouldn't even exist. Some were overlooked because their writing was too complex. Others lived in the wrong place or the wrong time. Some were just unlucky. But each of them contributed something powerful, something original, to the world of thought. Their ideas influenced science, ethics, politics, art, or the very way we use language, even if we don't realize it. In this video from FactUp, we're going to explore 12 philosophers who rarely get the recognition they deserve. Each one with a unique worldview, a challenging insight, or a forgotten legacy that deserves to be rediscovered. So if you've ever felt like there's more to philosophy than just the big names, or if you're hungry for a different perspective, stay with us. You're about to meet minds that once shook the foundations of thought and might just shake yours too. Gottlob Frege, 1848 to 1925, the silent architect of modern logic. Most people studying philosophy never hear his name. Yet without Gottlob Frege, the very foundation of modern logic, mathematics, and analytic philosophy would be unrecognizable. He didn't just write about philosophy, he rebuilt its language. Born in Germany in 1848, Frege was a mathematician by training, but his real obsession was something deeper. How can we make thinking itself precise? His answer? A new logical system that went far beyond Aristotle's syllogisms. Frege introduced quantified logic, a way of capturing not just all men are mortal, but the structure beneath such statements. His 1879 work, Begriffsschrift, concept script, was a revolutionary formal system of logic, which many see as the true beginning of modern symbolic logic. Later, in the Foundations of Arithmetic, he attempted to show that mathematics itself could be built purely on logic. This bold project, logicism, aimed to prove that numbers, addition, even infinity, could be logically derived. Frege's genius, however, was mostly ignored during his lifetime. His writing was dense and his ideas too far ahead. But in the early 20th century, philosophers like Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein discovered his work and were stunned. Russell even admitted that Frege's insights had transformed his entire approach to logic and philosophy. One of Frege's lesser-known but groundbreaking contributions is in the philosophy of language. He distinguished between sense and reference, the idea that words don't just point to things, but carry meaning based on how we understand them. This subtle but powerful distinction laid the groundwork for semantic theory and linguistic analysis. Frege wasn't flashy. He didn't start schools or write manifestos, but he quietly built the intellectual machinery that would power an entire century of philosophy, logic, and computer science. Today, every philosophy student learns symbolic logic. Few know they're walking the path he paved. Perhaps his own quiet nature matched his legacy, unseen by many, but supporting everything beneath. Wilhelm Dilthey is one of those philosophers who doesn't belong to any famous school of thought, because he built a bridge between them. A bridge connecting philosophy, history, psychology, and the humanities. If today we're familiar with ideas like lived experience or phenomenological understanding, it's thanks in part to this German thinker. Unlike many of his contemporaries who were fascinated by mathematics or formal logic, Dilthey turned his attention to real human life, to history, emotion, culture, upbringing, and the impact of time on the human spirit. He believed that the human sciences, like history, literature, and sociology, couldn't be understood through the same methods used in the natural sciences. Why? Because their subject is the human being, complex, self-aware, and constantly evolving. Dilthey introduced a key concept to philosophy. Verstehen, a German word meaning understanding or inner comprehension. For him, people cannot be fully grasped through external observation alone. They must be understood from within, through empathy and interpretation. This insight would later influence phenomenology, hermeneutics, existential psychology, and even modern psychotherapy. In works like Introduction to the Human Sciences and Poetry and Experience, Dilthey argued that culture, art, literature, and everyday life are all bearers of truth, not just science or logic. For him, the deepest truths are embedded in lived experience, in historical context, and in personal narratives. He represented an intellectual resistance to the dominance of scientism. While many of his peers overlooked him, his thought quietly paved the way for future minds like Hans-Georg Gadamer, Martin Heidegger, and Karl Jaspers. Dilthey is a thinker who reminded us that to understand humanity, we must listen to its stories, not just measure its patterns. He may not be remembered in textbooks as widely as others, but without him, 20th century thought would have lacked one of its most essential foundations. The philosopher of layers, a seeker of reality's deep structure. If philosophy is the quest to understand existence, then Nikolai Hartmann was one of the rare thinkers who turned away from questions about man or God and focused instead on being itself. Not the surface of things, but the hidden architecture beneath them. A German-Latvian philosopher of the 20th century, Hartmann played a key role in reviving ontology, the study of being, at a time when many thought it was outdated. But Hartmann believed that reality wasn't flat or uniform. Instead, he argued that the world is made up of multiple layers of being, each with its own unique structure and laws. He proposed 4 fundamental levels of reality. 1. The material layer, objects, forces. 2. The biological layer, life, instinct. 3. The psychological layer, consciousness, emotion. 4. And the spiritual cultural layer, ethics, reason, art. Each level is real, irreducible, and operates on its own principles. You can't explain love through chemistry or moral values through evolution alone. In this way, Hartmann became a powerful critic of reductionism, the idea that everything can be boiled down to physics or biology. In works like The Structure of the Real World and Ethics, Hartmann showed that moral values aren't just human inventions or feelings. They have a kind of objective reality. Ethics, for him, isn't a social contract or personal intuition, but a distinct layer of being with its own inner logic. He also advocated a form of critical realism. Reality exists independently of us, but our knowledge of it is always incomplete and evolving. Philosophy, then, must be humble, always reaching for the truth, while accepting that it may never fully grasp it. Hartmann was one of the last systematic metaphysicians of Europe, fearlessly tackling the big questions without falling into mysticism or oversimplification. Despite his major influence on later continental philosophers, his dense writing style and complex models kept him in the background, away from the fame of figures like Heidegger or Sartre. But if we ever want to understand the structure of reality not from above, but from within, Hartmann's name will quietly wait for us at the foundation. The philosopher of process, the man who saw a world in motion. Is reality fixed and static? Or is it constantly becoming, shifting, and evolving? For Alfred North Whitehead, the answer was clear. Reality is process. He was one of the few philosophers who dared to see the universe not as a collection of things, but as a web of ongoing events, unfolding, interacting, and transforming. Originally trained as a mathematician, Whitehead co-authored the groundbreaking Principia Mathematica with Bertrand Russell, a foundational work in symbolic logic. But unlike Russell, who remained rooted in logic and language analysis, Whitehead ventured into metaphysics, with a vision unlike any other. In his major work Process and Reality, Whitehead proposed a radical idea. Reality is composed of events, not substances. These events are not static entities, but dynamic occurrences in constant relation. Existence is not about being, it's about becoming. Even God, in Whitehead's view, is not a distant, unchanging entity, but a participant in the process, what he called the ultimate lure toward harmony, creativity, and value. This concept inspired what is now known as process theology, a movement that remains influential in some philosophical and theological circles, especially in the US. Whitehead believed that science, ethics, art, and religion all stem from the same core, the lived, evolving experience of reality. Philosophy, in his mind, should not be confined to dissecting language or logical structures. It must strive to understand the whole of existence. His writing was dense, and his metaphysical system highly original, so he never gained mass popularity. Yet his influence rippled widely, touching thinkers like Hannah Arendt, Nobel laureate Ilya Prigogine, and various ecological and interdisciplinary movements. Whitehead was a philosopher who didn't dwell in the past or get stuck in the present. He looked toward the future, toward what reality is still becoming, and perhaps with his thought, so can we. Paul Feyerabend was one of the most controversial voices in 20th century philosophy of science, not because he rejected science, but because he believed our view of science had become too rigid, too sacred, and too unquestioned. Born in Austria, Feyerabend initially pursued physics and even studied under Wolfgang Pauli, but his path soon shifted toward philosophy, where he found a new mission: to challenge the dominant image of science as a flawless method for discovering truth. His most famous work, Against Method, exploded like a philosophical bomb in academic circles. In it, Feyerabend argued that there is no single universal scientific method, no formal logic, no fixed experimental approach, not even Karl Popper's principle of falsifiability could capture the messy, unpredictable nature of scientific progress. According to Feyerabend, the history of science is full of breakthroughs that only happened because someone broke the rules, not followed them. That's why he coined his provocative slogan, "Anything goes," not as an endorsement of chaos, but as a reminder that science, like art or politics, is a human creation, full of contradictions, power struggles, and cultural influences. He warned that science should not become a monopoly on truth, replacing philosophy, religion, tradition, or art. When that happens, he argued, science becomes a dogma, just as dangerous as any superstition. In fact, Feyerabend believed that schools should teach science alongside myths and other belief systems, not to promote confusion, but to encourage genuine choice and intellectual freedom. Many criticized him for being too extreme, even reckless, but his ideas deeply influenced fields like sociology of science, interdisciplinary studies, and postmodern critiques of scientific authority. Feyerabend was a philosopher who reminded us that true reason sometimes means questioning reason itself. As he famously said, freedom of thought only makes sense if it includes the freedom to think against science, too. The philosopher of clarity and honesty, the man who said good means good. In a world where many philosophers got lost in linguistic puzzles, moral relativism, and abstract complexity, G.E. Moore stood out by doing something radical. He spoke plainly. Moore, a British philosopher and a founding figure of analytic philosophy, brought a fresh, clear voice to one of philosophy's most tangled questions: what is good? In his groundbreaking book Principia Ethica, Moore argued that good is a basic, indefinable concept, just like the color yellow. You can't break it down or define it in terms of something else. It isn't the same as pleasure, desire, or usefulness. Good just is. With this bold claim, he challenged utilitarianism and any ethical theory that tried to reduce goodness to natural or psychological terms. This became known as the naturalistic fallacy, the mistake of trying to define moral terms with non-moral ones. But Moore wasn't just redefining ethics. He was reshaping the way philosophy was done. Alongside Bertrand Russell, he helped pioneer a new method of logical analysis, a careful step-by-step examination of concepts focused on clarity and precision. He believed that many philosophical problems were really problems of language, and that by thinking clearly, we could resolve them. What made Moore unique was his unwavering commitment to common sense and moral intuition. He asked, why do we believe friendship, beauty, or honesty are good? The answer, he said, lies in our direct moral experience, not in complicated theories. Moore didn't offer grand systems or metaphysical blueprints. Instead, he offered intellectual honesty and a challenge to philosophers to say what they really meant. Though not widely known outside academic circles, Moore's influence shaped the next generation of thinkers, from Ludwig Wittgenstein to John Rawls. His work became a foundation for moral philosophy, analytic method, and the modern demand for philosophical clarity. He was the quiet philosopher who reminded us, sometimes truth is simpler than we think, if only we're brave enough to see it. The father of pragmatism, the man who linked logic to life. In the history of American philosophy, few figures are as foundational and as overlooked as Charles Sanders Peirce. He was the true father of pragmatism, a philosophical approach that redefined the meaning of truth itself. Peirce was a brilliant polymath, philosopher, logician, mathematician, and scientist. Born in 19th century America, he lived most of his life in poverty and obscurity with no stable academic position. But in solitude, he quietly laid the groundwork for one of the most influential philosophical movements of the modern era. His core idea in pragmatism was this: the meaning of any concept lies in its practical consequences. Truth isn't some fixed, abstract ideal, it's what works. If a belief leads to useful outcomes in the real world, it holds value. Peirce argued that ideas should be judged by their effects, not by how elegant or logical they sound on paper. But Peirce's contributions went far beyond pragmatism. He also founded semiotics, the theory of signs, how we interpret symbols, words, and meanings. He believed that human understanding is built through interpreting signs, layer by layer. His work here still shapes modern linguistics, media theory, and even user experience design. As a logician, Peirce went further than Aristotle or even Frege. He developed innovative systems of symbolic logic that would later influence computer science and artificial intelligence. His vision of reason was dynamic, evolving, and deeply tied to experimentation and inquiry. Despite his genius, Peirce struggled throughout life. Institutions ignored him, and he published little during his lifetime. He died in relative obscurity. But today he is recognized as a visionary of philosophy's future. Peirce believed that truth must be lived, not just stated. An idea without real-world consequence was, to him, little more than noise. In a world still obsessed with theories and abstractions, Peirce's philosophy remains a call to return to what matters: what works, what changes lives, and what makes meaning. The philosopher of loyalty, a human voice in American thought. In the midst of American pragmatism, defined by names like William James and John Dewey, there was a quieter, more ethical voice. Josiah Royce, a philosopher whose central concern was not truth or utility, but loyalty. Born in California and educated at Harvard and in Europe, Royce became one of the leading thinkers of his time. But unlike his contemporaries who focused on experience and action, Royce sought something deeper, something rooted in ethics, commitment, and the inner life. In his influential work, The Philosophy of Loyalty, Royce argued that loyalty is the foundation of a meaningful life. For him, morality wasn't just about rules or consequences, it was about devotion to a cause greater than oneself. Loyalty, in his view, connects the individual to others and to a shared purpose. Without it, society loses its moral fabric. But this loyalty was not blind allegiance. On the contrary, true loyalty meant conscious, chosen commitment, even when it's difficult. In an age increasingly defined by radical individualism, Royce reminded us that we find ourselves through our responsibilities to others. He also developed a profound and compassionate view of guilt and redemption. He believed that even our moral failures could be transformed into growth if faced with honesty and accountability. While Royce was respected in his time, his name gradually faded into the background, overshadowed by louder voices in American philosophy. Yet his ideas have endured in moral psychology, theology, and social philosophy. Royce was the philosopher who reminded us that real life is not about freedom from others, but connection with them. That loyalty to truth, to others, to a cause, is not a limitation, but a path to becoming fully human. In a world still struggling with meaning and belonging, his voice deserves to be heard again. Simone Weil, 1909 to 1943, the philosopher of suffering and justice, the woman who lived philosophy, not just wrote it. Some philosophers sit at desks, theorizing about the world. Simone Weil was not one of them. She lived her philosophy in factories, on battlefields, and among the poor. Her life was a direct and radical embodiment of her beliefs. Born into a French-Jewish intellectual family, Weil was a brilliant mind, quickly rising through France's top academic circles. But instead of pursuing comfort and recognition, she chose a path of voluntary suffering, believing that truth and justice could only be understood through direct experience of human pain. She worked in factories to understand the plight of laborers, volunteered in the Spanish Civil War to stand against oppression, and later worked on farms, sharing the struggles of peasants during wartime, all while writing some of the most profound reflections on ethics, spirituality, and justice. In works like Gravity and Grace and The Need for Roots, Weil portrayed the human soul as a fragile yet sacred vessel, longing for truth, aching under injustice, and capable of grace. Her concept of attention, became central. To truly love or understand another human being, one must offer pure, undivided attention, free from ego, desire, or control. Though drawn deeply to Christianity and the figure of Christ, Weil refused to be baptized. She believed that staying on the margins of religion, not within its institutional center, was the only way to remain honest before God. She wrote, "True love asks for nothing, not even to be seen. It just is silent, like light." Weil's life ended tragically young at 34 due to illness and self-imposed malnutrition during exile. Yet her legacy continues to burn like a quiet flame in the fields of moral philosophy, mysticism, and human rights. Simone Weil was not a philosopher of comfort, but of conscience. She believed that without sacrifice, there can be no justice, and without suffering, no real understanding. And so she gave herself, not to ideas, but to people, and to the pain they carried. Giambattista Vico, 1668 to 1744, the prophet of history, the man who realized that humans create their own world. While the 17th century was dominated by rationalism, mathematics, and Cartesian logic, Giambattista Vico, an Italian philosopher from Naples, looked elsewhere, toward myth, language, poetry, and the lives of ordinary people. And in them, he found a deeper truth. In his groundbreaking work, The New Science, Scienza Nuova, Vico proposed a revolutionary idea. We can only truly know what we ourselves have made. This meant that nature, created by God or chance, may remain partially mysterious to us, but history, society, and culture are human-made, and therefore knowable. While most of his contemporaries sought truth through pure reason, Vico turned to myth, tradition, religion, and language. He believed these weren't primitive errors, but expressions of early human creativity, tools by which people made sense of a chaotic world. Vico offered a bold vision of history as a cyclical process, moving through 3 stages. 1, the age of gods, mythical consciousness. 2, the age of heroes, aristocratic societies. 3, the age of humans, rationality and laws. But he warned that progress isn't permanent. Civilizations could collapse and the cycle might begin again. History for Vico wasn't linear. It moved in spirals. Long before Hegel or Marx, Vico laid the groundwork for a philosophical understanding of history, rooted not in abstract logic, but in human actions, language, and collective imagination. He was largely ignored in his lifetime. His style was dense, his ideas unconventional, and his work far ahead of its time. But today, Vico is hailed as a pioneer in the philosophy of history, anthropology, and cultural studies. Vico reminded us that to understand ourselves, we must look at the stories we've created, the myths we've lived by, and the institutions we've built. He once wrote, "To know the human world, we must enter into the minds that shaped it. And maybe, just maybe, reason alone isn't enough. We need imagination too." Peter Wessel Zapf, 1899 to 1990. The philosopher of tragedy, the man who called consciousness a curse. High in the misty mountains of Norway lived a philosopher who stared at life with ruthless honesty, not out of despair, but with rare philosophical clarity. Peter Wessel Zapf, mountaineer, writer, and radical pessimist, believed that human consciousness is not a gift, but a tragic mistake. In his powerful essay, The Tragedy of Man, and his philosophical work on the tragic, Zapf proposed a haunting idea. Humans are over-equipped for this world. Unlike animals, we don't just feel pain, we understand it. We anticipate suffering, reflect on death, and feel the weight of meaninglessness. Our minds, he argued, are too self-aware for our own good. To cope with this unbearable awareness, Zapf claimed that humans unconsciously use 4 defense mechanisms. 1, isolation, blocking out unpleasant realities. 2, anchoring, attaching ourselves to traditions, religions, or ideologies. 3, distraction, filling life with trivialities and noise. 4, sublimation, channeling existential dread into creativity, philosophy, or art. To Zapf, all of these were elaborate self-deceptions, ways to avoid facing the grim truth, that life has no inherent meaning, and our awareness of this is the core of our suffering. Yet despite this, Zapf wasn't a nihilist in the destructive sense. He didn't advocate suicide or surrender. Instead, he offered a tragic heroism, to live with dignity and consciousness in the face of absurdity. Like a climber who ascends a peak knowing he'll fall but climbs anyway, because the climb itself is an act of defiance. Zapf remained little known outside Norway during his life. He published sparingly and never sought fame. But today, his ideas resonate deeply with existentialists, pessimists, and modern philosophers wrestling with the burden of being. Writers like Thomas Ligotti and thinkers like Emile Cioran echo his legacy. He was a philosopher who believed awareness is beautiful but unbearably costly, and we as humans are the only creatures who must pay that price. 12. George Santayana, 1863 to 1952, the philosopher of memory and beauty, the man who said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." At a time when philosophy was becoming increasingly analytical, technical, and rigid, George Santayana stood apart, a philosopher who brought poetry, memory, and beauty into the heart of thought. He wasn't just a thinker, he was a poet, a novelist, and a cultural critic. Born in Spain, raised in the US, and later living much of his life in Europe, Santayana straddled cultures and disciplines. Instead of narrowing philosophy to logic alone, he broadened it, embracing art, religion, experience, and imagination. His was a philosophy of life itself. In his major work, The Life of Reason, Santayana argued that true reason isn't cold or detached, it grows from experience. It reflects our needs, memories, and ideals. Rationality, in his view, should serve life, not dominate it. Santayana had a unique stance on religion as well. He was neither a believer nor a militant atheist. Instead, he saw religion as a powerful, poetic, and cultural symbol, something that, while not scientifically literal, held deep emotional and social truth. For him, myths and rituals offered meaning that reason alone couldn't provide. He is perhaps best remembered for a single line, often quoted but rarely attributed: "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." A sentence that has echoed through history books, speeches, and memorials, quietly carrying his voice. Santayana lived a quiet, contemplative life, eventually settling in a monastery in Italy. He distanced himself from academic fame but continued to write with grace and depth until his final days. He believed that philosophy without beauty is barren, and that beauty without thought is shallow. In a world obsessed with logic and results, Santayana offered a gentler vision, that wisdom lies in remembering, in feeling, and in seeing life as something to be cherished, not just solved. Discover 12 lesser-known philosophers who changed the world with their powerful ideas. From forgotten geniuses of logic and ethics to rebellious minds who challenged science and history, this video explores the hidden side of philosophy you've probably never encountered. Learn how their ideas shaped modern thought, society, morality, and more. Perfect for philosophy lovers, curious minds, and anyone looking to think differently. Subscribe to FactUp for more videos on philosophy, history, and deep ideas.